Colored folks think they can doctor. The words spat from the saloon porch tore through the moment Amara Johnson set foot in Hollow Creek. The dust-red town had no welcome for a woman physician, much less one whose skin bore the shade scorned. Scornful stares, cruel laughter, and muttered jeers wrapped around her, turning the decaying wooden office the county handed her into a battleground. But that very afternoon, when a cowboy staggered in, blood trickling crimson down his brow, the town held its breath. Amara stitched every cut beneath the flicker of an oil lamp, her hands steady as steel, while outside the crowd waited for her to fail. And then, from that very man, against the storm of prejudice, came a vow no one expected. I want to be the first man you kiss and the last man you love. Would those words carve out a love story or spark a new wildfire across the plains? Summer of 1878, the sun hung high in the gray-gold sky of Wyoming, burning down on the red dust road that led into the town of Hollow Creek. The wind carried with it the scent of scorched grass, dry earth, and the rattle of wagon wheels grinding over hard ground. The stagecoach from the east had just come to its final stop, a place folks more often called a dust town than a welcome haven. Each strike of hooves sent clouds of grit swirling into the air, leaving the whole scene restless and raw. The door swung open, and from within stepped a woman. Her dark homespun dress was dulled from the long journey, its hem stained with the soil of 100 miles. In her hand swung a heavy leather satchel filled with a few hard-won possessions: scalpels, clamps, glass syringes, rolls of cotton, and powdered medicine she had saved for months to gather. Amara Johnson. Her name meant nothing yet in Hollow Creek, but the moment her boots touched the earth, every eye turned and measured her from head to toe. For a heartbeat, the air stilled, then whispers broke loose. A man leaning against the saloon wall spat into the dirt with a crooked grin. Colored folk think they can doctor. A woman tugged her shawl lower across her face, but her voice held sharp derision. Hard enough trusting a woman, let alone that color. Who's she fixing to heal? The words sliced through the air like a blade, and laughter followed. Laughter laced with scorn, with the cheap delight of cruelty, as though Amara's very presence had become the day's amusement. Amara did not answer. She only stood for a beat, her hand tightening around the satchel's strap until her knuckles blanched. The sneers, the ridicule, these were scars she had carried since childhood. At 10 years old, running down a Georgia street beside her mother, she had heard curses just the same. Grown, when she sought entry to a medical school, doors slammed one after another, until at last a small institution for women admitted her. Even there, whispers had stalked her steps. The road's heat rose in waves, trying to swallow her small figure among towering horsemen and sun-bleached buildings. Yet she did not bow her head. Amara drew a breath, lifted her chin, and fixed her dark eyes on the path ahead. The storm of contempt would not turn her back. She knew this road would not be easy, but she had long since learned how to walk roads paved with scorn. A boy of about 10 clung to his mother's hand, staring at her with open wonder. His eyes were clear, unclouded, yet by the doubts of grown folk. Amara let a small smile touch her lips. It was a fragile thing, but it drifted into the heavy air like a breeze that eases suffocation. Hollow Creek was no grand place. Its main street was little more than a row of wooden frames, a general store, a smithy, the saloon, and a small chapel perched on the rise. At the far end stood a rough cabin the town council had granted her new clinic, not out of faith, but as a showpiece for a boastful mayor eager to parade civilization before Eastern traders. A woman doctor, and black at that, he counted her more as a curiosity than a physician. Amara walked on, boots striking the dust. The stagecoach clattered behind, but she was apart now, the lone figure beneath every stare. On the saloon porch, cowboys lounged with boots propped high, mugs tilting in idle hands, eyes narrowed in mockery. One let out a long whistle, another curled his lip. Since when did this town become a testing ground for Eastern experiments? She did not turn. Each step pressed into the earth was her answer, each stride an echo of her mother's words. Never let them decide who you are. When they laugh, let your footsteps be the reply. The cabin the council had rented for her stood waiting. When Amara pressed the latch, the door groaned open, and a wave of damp wood and dust struck her face, sharp and stale, the smell of a house long without breath of life. The ceiling sagged low, the boards patched together in haste, gaps leaking shafts of light that cut across the blotched wooden floor. Dust blanketed the single table, a chair leaned crooked with a broken leg, and a shelf sagged beneath cobwebs. This they called a clinic. Amara drew in a steady breath. The reek of horse, sweat, and town air pressed through the open window, but she would not let her resolve falter. Setting her leather satchel upon the table, she fetched a cloth, dipped it into the barrel of water in the corner, and began to wipe. Each stroke swept away more than grime. It stripped a layer of disdain. Dust swirled in the shafts of light, drifting like remnants of the past. She had no choice but to brush aside. She laid out her instruments, a scalpel still gleaming though its handle was worn smooth, a glass syringe catching the slant of the sun, powders wrapped carefully in wax paper. Needles showed marks of grinding, yet were sharp as ever. She checked each piece, placing them in careful order. Her hands moved with a surgeon's certainty, every gesture deliberate, nothing wasted. Outside, footsteps shuffled. A shadow paused by the window, an eye pressed to the crack. A laugh, soft and cruel, slipped through. "Lord help us, who'd let that kind hold a knife?" Another voice, lower but clear enough to pierce. "Well, it'll save $1 hauling sick folk to the next town. Dying under her hand wouldn't surprise me." The laughter that followed was dry as sand. Amara did not lift her head. She scrubbed the table, braced the broken chair, shut the window tight against the dust. Yet every word, every chuckle pricked her chest like hidden thorns. Her mind drifted back to Philadelphia, to the women's medical school where each hallway seemed to hum with suspicion. Notes tossed on her desk. Dolls know nothing of anatomy. Professors telling her straight-faced, "You'd better learn the needle for mending cloth. No patient will let you touch them." And still, she had graduated among the top, her trial surgeries carried out with success under the very eyes that had doubted her. This door was more than rotting planks. It was a threshold. Hollow Creek would test her in ways no place had dared. The sun slipped west, shadows climbing the walls. Amara set a lamp upon the table and struck the wick. Flame flickered, spreading a warm glow across her tools, casting the shabby room in a semblance of purpose. She opened the window to let the evening drift in. The street had quieted. Men strayed from the saloon, staggering toward the stables. Children's laughter had stilled. A harmonica wandered faint from a cabin porch. Still, at the corner, A few figures pointed toward her door, their doubt as plain as daylight. She knew tomorrow every move she made would be judged, every patient would become a test, and one mistake would topple all. Closing the window, she turned back, her calloused hand pressed against the rough table. "I've come this far," she told herself, "not to turn back, not to lay down." Beneath the hush of night, fear lingered. She knew a single word from Maddox or the town's men of power could drive her out, brand her a failure. Yet tangled with that fear was pride, fierce and quiet. She had outlasted sneers and closed doors before. Here upon this wind-scoured plain, she would outlast them again. The chapel bell tolled the evening prayer. Amara stood straighter, adjusted her dress, and surveyed the room. Imperfect, meager, but hers. Each crack in the wall, each splintered board would bear witness to her fight. Drawing the chair near, she opened the small notebook brought from Philadelphia. The first page of Hollow Creek. Her pen carved steady lines. Day 1. I arrive in Hollow Creek. They laugh. They scorn. But I will open this door with my own hands. This will be a place of healing, of bodies, and of dignity. Night had fallen full. Shadows lay thick across the wooden street, but her lamp still burned, one of the few lights left shining. Its glow spilled through the window, an unspoken declaration. A doctor had come. A woman, black, yet a doctor nonetheless. Amara sat long at the table, her silhouette etched by firelight against the wall. In the solitude, she saw herself plain, weary, scarred, but unbroken. The door had opened. Beyond it lay no retreat, only the path forward. Evening in Hollow Creek always carried a weight, heavy as lead. The sun slid grudgingly off the mountain's crown, casting harsh streaks of gold across the plains, stirring the red dust into clouds that rose like smoke. The main street, hushed but for the murmur spilling from the saloon, shook suddenly with the pounding rush of hooves. Iron shoes hammered the hard ground, sharp and urgent as war drums. Amara was bent over a small basin, rinsing her wooden bowl before her meager supper, when the clinic door burst open so hard the hinges cried out. A gust of dust-laden wind swept inside, nearly toppling the oil lamp on her desk. In the dimming light of late day, a tall figure staggered through. Heavy boots dragged across the floorboards, shoulders broad beneath a blood-stained shirt, his sun-darkened face masked by a long gash bleeding down his brow. He moved slowly, each step laborious, but his stance did not collapse. The man, Luke Carver, though the name meant nothing to her yet, wore the look of one bred to saddle and storm. Behind him tumbled 3-4 cowboys, half supporting, half jeering. One let out a whistle, voice cutting with ridicule. Fall off a horse and he acts like he's been shot in battle. Get him to a real doctor before this one experiments. Laughter barked, harsh and dry, spilling through the open doorway until passers-by stopped to stare. An old woman pulled her shawl across her face, whispering. Children craned their necks through the window, eyes wide. Amara stood still, bowl in hand, water dripping to the floor. She knew that look in their faces, half doubt, half hungry for spectacle, waiting for her to falter. Never once had they hoped she would succeed. Luke stumbled another step, bracing his hand on the scarred table. Blood streaked down, darkening his faded shirt. Yet his gaze, lit under thick brows, held no plea, only a wordless pride. Amara set the bowl aside, seized a cloth, and stepped forward. Her voice carried steady against the silence. "Lay him down before he bleeds further." A cowboy burst out laughing. "Listen at her! Thinks she's running a grand hospital in Philadelphia. Let's see how long before Luke keels over." But none moved. They waited, as though the choice belonged not to her, but to the man bleeding before them. Luke's eyes locked with hers, unblinking. Then he shrugged off the arms dragging him away. His voice, hoarse from thirst yet steady as stone, cut the air. "Let her do it." The words stilled the room. Outside, hoofbeats halted. The crowd swelling on the porch froze mid-breath. Some sneered, others frowned. To place faith in a black woman doctor, such a thing felt reckless to them, near madness. Amara's chest tightened, but her hands grew firm. In Luke's defiant gaze, she found what she had lacked: a chance. She turned, drew open the wooden drawer, and set out needle, thread, whiskey, and clean gauze. The lamplight caught the needle's gleam, making onlookers shift uneasily. Whispers rippled like wind. "Mind she don't sew his eye shut." "Whole town circus right here." She ignored them. Instruments laid in careful rows, the table scrubbed with whiskey, a square of cloth spread clean. Each motion swift, precise, allowing no room for error. And slowly, the murmurs dulled into silence, drawn by the gravity of her movements. Luke, blood dripping down his collar, gave no cry. He lowered himself onto the bench by the window, composed as a soldier accustomed to wounds. His eyes stayed fixed on Amara, unwavering. In that instant, she knew this was no mere treatment, but a trial. If she faltered, if she yielded, her standing would collapse here and now. But if she stitched true, if her hands held, a crack of trust might be won. Wiping her palms on a clean rag, she inhaled deep and motioned. Set him on the table. His friends shifted, one ready to protest, but Luke's single nod silenced them. They eased him down, and Amara pulled her chair close. In the yellow lamp glow, her shadow merged with his, doctor and cowboy cast against the rough-hewn wall. Faces pressed closer at the window, the town holding its breath. Amara uncorked the whiskey, the sharp scent filling the small room. Gauze, needle, thread, all ready. Her hand trembled once and then steadied, calm as the first day she entered the dissecting hall. Before she began, she glanced at Luke. He dipped his head faintly, eyes burning with quiet resolve, as if to say, "I trust you." And in that glance, amid the hush of a doubtful town, Amara's heart stumbled in its rhythm. The small wooden room held its breath as Amara pulled on her cloth gloves and uncorked the whiskey. The sharp pop cracked the silence like a starting gun. The acrid scent rushed through the air, cutting over the iron tang of blood dripping to the floor. Luke lay on his side across the table, eyes half closed, breath slow but steady. Sweat trickled down his temple, streaking with blood into a dark line. Amara soaked a wad of gauze in whiskey and pressed it firm against the gash. A hiss slipped through Luke's clenched teeth, but he did not cry out, as his friends had clearly hoped. One of them, arms folded near the door, gave a dry chuckle. "Well, reckon he's about to pass out." But no one laughed with him. Every eye was locked on Amara's hands, small, dark-skinned, moving with a composure that silenced the room. She changed the gauze, clearing the blood, until the torn edges of flesh lay exposed. The wound was deep, ragged. She drew a breath, threaded black cord through the needle's eye. Her hand trembled for a heartbeat, then steadied. Outside the window, the jeers dwindled into tense quiet. The first stitch pierced flesh. Luke's shoulder twitched, his fist tightened, but not a sound escaped him. Amara drew the thread through, tied it neat. Fresh blood welled, scarlet and slick, but her hand did not falter. 1 stitch, 2, 3. The room shrank to the whisper of needle through skin, the rasp of thread. Men who had come to watch her fail now stood rapt, unwilling to look away. "She's sewing him solid," one muttered, half awed. A sharp elbow silenced him, though his wide eyes betrayed the same surprise. Amara pressed on, steady rhythm, left hand bracing, right hand stitching clean and true. Each bite of the needle matched the last, straight and even, a seam no tailor could fault. Sweat gathered on her brow, but her gaze never strayed from the wound. She knew each movement now was more than medicine. It was an answer to the entire town waiting at her door. By the 7th stitch, Luke's eyes opened, fixed on the wooden ceiling, then slid to her. Through sweat and blood, she caught the look, pride and unyielding trust. It caught her breath, but her hand held steady. The final knot tied, Amara cleaned the line of sutures and bound his brow in clean white cloth, firm and exact. Only then did she exhale, palms damp inside the gloves. "It's done," she said softly, yet the words carried. Luke pushed himself upright. For an instant he swayed, then sat tall. His broad hand touched the bandage, and he turned to his companions. "Anyone here still thinks she ain't a doctor?" The words fell like a hammer. The crowded room stilled, faces flushed, boots shuffled. Not one dared speak. At the window, a boy's whisper slipped free. "She's a real doctor." The child's voice rang truer than any proclamation. Amara's vision blurred. She bent to her instruments, hiding the tremor at her lips. Luke rose, still pale but proud as ever. He set his hand against the table, his voice deep, carrying to the street outside. "If not for her, I'd be dead before sundown. Remember that." Those words were not just for his friends, but for every doubtful face pressed against the glass. Somewhere in the crowd, a throat cleared, a shawl was pulled tight, a figure slipped away. Others murmured, no longer mocking, but uneasy, uncertain. In that moment, the town's hard soil shifted, as though the first stake had been driven deep. Amara's grip tightened on the table's edge, her chest swelling with something nameless. For the first time in Hollow Creek, a man had stood beside her. For the first time, the word doctor carried weight instead of scorn. Luke started for the door, his men trailing. But at the threshold, he turned. His gray eyes caught hers, bright with something unspoken. A brief smile touched his mouth. "Thank you, doctor," he said firmly. The door shut. Silence filled the room, broken only by the settling dust. Amara sank into her chair, her hands trembling at last. Outside, the whispers of the street ebbed into the dry wind. The town might not be hers yet, but one man had believed, and for Amara, one was enough to change everything. Since that red-dusted, blood-stained afternoon, Luke Carver's name had become bound to the little clinic door. His head wound needed tending, and that simple reason began a string of visits no one could have foreseen. At first, as Amara expected, he came only to have the bandage changed. A few days later, the sound of hooves struck the porch again. She pretended to busy herself with bottles or notes, though each thud of his horse's hooves set her heart drumming in ways she could not name. When the door swung open, light slanting across his frame, tall, sun-browned, gray eyes calm as dusk, The room itself seemed to shift. Luke always took the long bench by the window, as if it were his own seat. He said little of his wound, only let her unbind, inspect, and tie it anew. But after the silence lingered, he would offer some scrap of story. A herd of cattle scattered by wolves on the wind. A young colt that bucked its saddle clean off and stomped the trough to splinters. His voice was low, steady, never urgent, yet some detail always drew a smile to Amara's lips, or a quiet shake of her head. Once he told how a bridle slipped while he crossed a stream. The horse bolted, nearly unseating him. He had managed to wrestle the reins back, steady himself, and only after it ended did he realize his own body shook like a leaf. Amara raised her brows. "So you do know fear?" The corner of his mouth lifted, just barely. "Any man who says otherwise is lying. The difference is whether we let fear steer the reins." That thought stayed with her long after he left, echoing in the lamplight as she scribbled her notes. Each time Luke came, eyes followed. Some shook their heads, some smirked. Whispered talk spread quick. Carver spending time with the colored lady doctor. Some claimed it was pity. Others hissed that he did it just to needle Maddox, the ranch boss who loathed Amara's presence in town. Luke never bothered to explain. He walked through her door plain as day, sat down, let her work in calm silence, as if there were no barrier at all between them. That ease unsettled her more than scorn ever could. For in a place like Hollow Creek, a white cowboy lingering in a black woman's clinic was tender enough to spark grudges. Yet still, when his shadow crossed the porch, a warmth rose in her chest. She bent her head over gauze and vials to hide the fragile lift of her heart. One evening, as Amara was scrubbing her tools, Luke returned without his jacket. A long scar traced down his arm, bare in the lamplight. Sitting down, he said simply, "Just want to be sure my head's still right." She unwound the bandage. The wound had knit clean, the stitches neat, the skin drawing together firm. She dabbed salve, wrapped it in fresh cloth. He watched her hands in silence. Then, at length, his voice rumbled, "I once saw a doctor. Man praised by a whole town. Stitch worse than you just did." Amara froze, heat rushing her cheeks. Before she could reply, he added, "It's steady hands that save a life. Doesn't matter whose they are." She bent her head, hiding the sudden light in her eyes, tying the band snug. "You talk too much. Best get some rest if you want that head to heal." Luke only smiled and said no more. So the visits continued. Sometimes he stayed minutes, sometimes near an hour, spinning tales of horses and rivers, or sitting wordless, the room filled only with the scratch of Amara's pen or the wind rattling the shutters. Strangely, even his silences thinned the weight in the air. Little by little, Amara found she no longer felt so alone. She grew accustomed to hoofbeats on the porch, to the tall figure leaning against her doorframe, to the gravel-rich voice that carried dust and pasture in its tone. Yet with the warmth came a new unease. She knew this town too well. A whisper could swell to a storm. A single glance could turn into a shackle. And Luke's presence by her side was already stirring envy and spite. That night, after Luke rode away, Amara sat by her window, looking at the few lanterns glowing along the main street. She opened her worn notebook and wrote one simple line: "There are footsteps I both dread and long for. But it is those footsteps that remind me I am still here." She closed the book, snuffed the lamp. Outside, the wind scattered red dust along the empty road. Rumor in Hollow Creek spread quicker than prairie wind. One glance traded in the street, one stop of a horse at the wrong porch, and it blossomed into stories beneath every saloon lamp and on every front stoop. Since Luke Carver had begun his steady visits to Amara's clinic, whispers swelled into a tide. A white cowboy tied up with the black lady doctor? The phrase echoed like a refrain, circling the saloon where men hunched over whiskey, laughter sharpened with contempt. At the general store, housewives hushed when Amara entered, then muttered behind her back, "Whatever her medicine is, it's strong enough to keep Luke Carver coming." From porch rails, children jeered playfully, "There goes Luke's doctor," their innocent teasing cutting her heart like a blade. Each whisper tightened Amara's chest. She knew too well the cost of becoming a town's amusement. Hatred, hard stares, slander that could shred a woman's name. She had seen it before, how a black woman who stepped beyond the place others carved for her was made a target. Now it was her turn to walk that road. Luke met the scorn differently. To every barb he answered with a shrug, calm as wind over grass. "Let 'em talk. I don't care." He said it lightly, yet to Amara it was a balm she dared not admit, a comfort she scarcely allowed herself to trust. One evening, crossing past the saloon on her way to a patient's house, laughter spilled out into the street. A hoarse voice rang clear. "Told you, Luke Carver's gone mad, letting her lay a needle to his face. Who lets a colored woman stitch a man?" The saloon roared. Amara clenched her satchel, shoulders stiff, quickening her pace. But when she returned, Luke was already waiting on her porch, leaning easy against the post, horse tied nearby. "Heard something new, did you?" he asked, casual. She only shook her head. He nodded once as if that was enough. And somehow, that quietness warmed her more than any defense. That night in her notebook she wrote, "They say everything under the sun. But when he says, 'I don't care,' I feel less alone. Perhaps that is my greatest fear, to be left alone in their contempt." Even the chapel walls did not keep gossip at bay. Some whispered to the pastor that such closeness between Luke and Amara stained the town's name. The pastor only said, "The Lord looks at the heart, not the skin." Yet the murmurs smoldered on, like coals hidden in ash. At the market, she reached to pay for vegetables. The woman behind the stall brushed Amara's hand aside, letting the coin fall and roll. With a cold glance, she said, "Money's all the same so long as it's clean." The meaning cut sharp. Laughter pricked around her. Amara stooped, picked up the coin, and left in silence. That evening, Luke returned. He had heard from a child who had seen. Without asking, he saddled his horse, rode straight to the same stall, bought his vegetables, and paid with a bright silver dollar. Then, before all watching, he said slow and clear, "Amara's money is as clean as this. Anyone thinks otherwise can open their mouth and prove it." He rode off, leaving the market hushed. When Amara heard, her heart clenched. She was angry at his recklessness, at how he made her stand out even louder. Yet beneath it, gratitude stirred, quiet but undeniable. At least, amid a sea of disdain, one man never wavered. The talk rolled on like a gray cloud over the town. But Amara noticed something new. More patients came. A woodcutter's split hand, a toothache, a fevered child. They arrived wary, but left lighter. Wariness softened into trust. They might whisper still in the market, but when sickness came, They turned to her because steady hands and sound knowledge could not be denied. One night, after the last patient gone, Amara sat staring at the lamp flame quivering on her desk. The wind outside carried a faint harmonica tune from the saloon down the street. She remembered the whispers, the sneers, and Luke's shrug. Let him talk. I don't care. For her, those words had become a wall that shielded her, however briefly, from the storm of prejudice. And because of that wall, she could sit in her little wooden room, heart still whole, ready for the next day. That night, the moon lay buried behind thick clouds, and all of Hollow Creek slept beneath the hush of wind rattling rusty tin roofs and the far-off bark of dogs. Amara had just folded her ledger, hand reaching for the lamp wick, when fists struck her clinic door, urgent, frantic, nothing like the knocks of daily ailments. "Doctor, please, help!" A woman's desperate cry tore through the stillness. Amara sprang to the latch. The door swung wide and a gaunt woman stumbled in, clutching a boy of 7 or 8. His face burned crimson, his small body shuddered violently, sweat streaming until his hair clung to his brow. Lips bluish, a strangled moan caught in his throat. Amara's heart clenched. This was no ordinary fever. She laid him upon the table, pulling a blanket over his trembling limbs. "When did it start?" she pressed. "This afternoon. Just heat at first, then the shakes. I'm so afraid. Please save him." Tears choked the mother's voice, her eyes wild with terror. Amara's palm met the boy's forehead. It seared like live coal. His breaths came ragged, body jerking with convulsions. Memory rose sharp from her training in Philadelphia. Nights of watching children burn with fever, doctors fighting to draw them back from the brink. She steadied herself. This was no time for fear. "Hold his shoulders. Don't let him fall," she told the mother. From her satchel she drew the glass syringe, precious tool carried all the way from the east, and a small vial of morphine. Under the lamplight the needle flashed, and the mother's eyes widened. "Is it safe?" she whispered. Amara's gaze held firm. "If not, your boy will not live till morning." The woman nodded, trembling. Amara sterilized the needle, drew the medicine, and slid it into the boy's thin arm. His body jolted, then slowly the spasms eased. She laid cool cloths upon his brow, replacing them again and again, wiping the sweat, coaxing his breath steady. Hours crept by. Wind keened through the eaves, the boy's faint moans breaking the silence. Amara never left his side, eyes fixed, hands working with patient rhythm, sponging heat, rubbing limbs to keep the blood moving. The mother huddled in the corner, fists knotted in her skirt, whispering prayers into the dark. Near midnight, the boy's breathing eased. His lips pinked, the furious heat relented. Relief poured from Amara's chest, quiet as a sigh loosed after battle. She touched his pulse, fast but strong. He murmured once, then slipped into deep sleep. The mother broke, sobbing, seizing Amara's hands until they ached. "Thank you, doctor. Thank God you're here." Tears ran down her hollow cheeks. Yet in her eyes, Amara saw something she had not glimpsed since stepping into Hollow Creek. Trust. Not suspicion, not the sting of mockery. Trust. Pure and unguarded, born from the edge of loss. Amara swallowed the tremor in her throat. He'll need rest, plenty of water, and close watching. Tonight, let him sleep. The woman nodded fiercely, showering her boy's damp hair with kisses before turning back. "I've heard what they say of you. All of it. But only you were here when I needed someone. The words stilled Amara. All the jeers, the whispers in the marketplace seemed to scatter like dust before the wind. Warmth rose in her chest, rare and unlooked for, cradling her like a mantle against the cold. When mother and son left into the night, Amara walked them to the door. The street lay hushed, lanterns swaying in the breeze. Their shadows stretched and vanished into darkness, leaving silence behind. Amara lingered beneath the chill wind. Hair stirred across her cheek before turning back inside. The lamp still burned, its glow resting upon instruments laid in neat rows. Tonight, she had held on to a life. But more than that, she had seen faith spark, fragile yet real, in the eyes of Hollow Creek. And that light was enough to carry her forward. At dawn, before the sun had burned the thin dew from Hollow Creek's main street, a murmur began to spread. By mid-morning, it rolled like thunder. Doctor gave Helen's boy the wrong medicine. Lord have mercy. What kind of bottle did she stick into him? No real doctor ever tried such things in this town. It's experiments, on children no less. The whispers swelled until a crowd gathered outside Amara's clinic. Men stood with arms crossed, women muttered, children peeked from behind skirts, their stares joining into a heavy wall. No one remembered who first said it, but all knew the hand behind it. Maddox, the wealthy rancher whose coin and cruelty made him king of Hollow Creek. To him, Amara's presence had always been an insult. His Hollow Creek was for white men. Women belonged at the stove. A black woman doctor was an outrage, a thorn he meant to rip out. Amara stood rigid in her doorway as the accusations struck like thrown knives. She harmed Helen's boy. Not fit to be called a doctor. Drive her out before someone else dies. The words dragged up memories she had buried. Mocking classmates in the East. Professors dismissing her work because of her skin. She had crossed 1,000 miles to outrun those shadows. Yet here they rose again, thick as ever. Her throat locked. In those eyes, angry, suspicious, she read a verdict already sealed. The crowd pressed closer, fists pounding her door. Then hooves thundered down the street. Red dust rose as Luke Carver rode in, tall in the early light. He swung down, strode through the mass as if through mist. Standing firm at her steps, his voice rolled deep. If not for her, that boy would already be dead. The shouting faltered. Silence dropped over the street. Luke's gaze swept the faces, flint bright. I was there. I saw the seizures, and it was these hands, he pointed to Amara, that kept him breathing till sunrise. Anyone who says otherwise, step forward and tell me to my face. No one moved. Some bowed their heads. Some shifted uneasily. Others scowled but looked away. Few men in Hollow Creek would pit themselves openly against Luke Carver, respected for both his strength and his iron temper. Across the way, Maddox appeared, cane planted firm, his smile thin as a knife. Carver, he said, voice slick as oil. Folk only want peace. A true doctor brings trust. But this... His eyes cut to Amara, dripping contempt. Luke stepped forward, words sharp as steel. If saving a child in crisis isn't the work of a true doctor, then this town has never seen one. I know this. Last night she saved that boy's life, and that's the only truth that matters. The weight of it fell like judgment. No jeers rose. Slowly, the crowd ebbed, grumbling, sighing, but yielding ground. Someone muttered, so long as the boy lives. Boots shuffled, dust settled, and the square began to clear. Amara stayed in the shadow of her door, her heart racing. She had spoken nothing, yet Luke's figure, unshaken among the mob, burned in her eyes like a pillar against the storm. Maddox struck his cane against the boards, hatred smoldering, before turning away. Over his shoulder came the hiss of threat. One day the truth will out, and she'll have nowhere left to run. The street emptied, leaving only Amara and Luke beneath the morning wind. Dust whirled between them, veiling the last stairs retreating down the lane. Luke looked back at her. "Joan, don't let their words shake you," he said quietly, though his tone was stone. Her lips pressed tight. The thank you caught in her throat, unspoken. She only nodded, blinking hard. In that moment she knew, no matter how the town whispered, no matter Maddox's schemes, one voice had risen, silencing the mob. And for her, that voice was stronger than them all. Night pressed heavy over Hollow Creek, the sky dark as iron, the wind tearing at the old willows on the town's edge as though to rip them out by their roots. Thunder rolled, flashing brief, violent light that left the world darker still. Amara's small clinic shuddered with each gust, the wooden door groaning like it might splinter apart. Her oil lamp flickered on the desk, throwing her bowed shadow long against the wall, thin, trembling, hunched over. All that day, jeers had clung to her like thorns. At the market, a hissed word, murderer. On the main street, a man spat at her feet. Even patients she had once treated now turned their backs. It was another kind of storm, one of stares, whispers, and condemnation, gnawing her soul more fiercely than the rain outside. She sat at her desk, hands clasped tight, shaking. On her half-written page, the ink bled into blurred lines where her tears had fallen. She whispered to herself that saving the boy's life was enough, that life itself was her answer. But the pounding fists of the morning, the bitter curses, the scorn etched into every face, these still cut deep, stripping bare the loneliness she had borne since childhood. A crack of thunder split the night. The door flung open. Wind and rain swept in, and with it a tall figure. Luke Carver stepped across the threshold, coat plastered to his shoulders, water dripping from his hair, boots thudding heavy on the boards. Yet in his storm-gray eyes burned a steady fire, fierce and unyielding. "Amara," his voice thundered above the storm, "they are not worth your sorrow." She startled, rising. "Why? Why come in weather like this? Out there?" "No storm can hold me back," he cut in, firm as steel. "All day I've heard their filth. But you did right. That boy lives, and that is proof enough. And still you sit here, letting tears pay the price for their ignorance?" Amara turned her face away, lamplight trembling across her figure. "You don't understand. I have lived my life under those eyes. My skin, my sex, they are weapons used against me. I crossed the east to find new ground, but everywhere it is the same." Luke stepped closer, floorboards creaking beneath his soaked weight. He laid his hat on the desk, water dripping. His voice dropped low, steady as bedrock. "I understand more than you think. I was told I'd never be enough to hold my father's ranch, never fit to keep what he built. But I didn't bow. Neither should you. For if you bend, you lose yourself." A shiver ran through her. She had heard scorn all her life, but never words like his, never spoken as if his own faith stood or fell with her. Lightning tore the sky. In the room only the two of them remained. the distance between them shrinking beneath storm and silence alike. "You think I can stand forever?" Her voice cracked. "Every day I hear I don't belong, that I'm a joke. However strong I try to be, I still feel small." Luke halted before her, his eyes lit with a strange mix, fierce yet gentle. His rough, calloused hand reached and closed over hers, still clenched tight. Warmth surged from his palm, a strength that stilled her trembling. "Small." He shook his head. "You held life in your hands last night. When the whole town slept, you alone stood between death and a child. You are the only doctor here with the courage to stand in the storm and save. That is not small." Tears broke free, not of shame but of being seen, finally seen for her true worth. The wind howled, the door rattled as though the storm meant to tear it down. Yet inside, Amara's heart grew calm. Luke stood drenched, yet firm as a pillar, his voice carrying a vow unspoken. She was no longer alone against the gale. Her breath shuddered, quiet yet resolute. "You can't always stand here to shield me, Luke." He met her eyes, a weary smile lifting the corner of his mouth, firm as a promise. "I didn't come to shield you. I came to remind you that you are already strong. I'm only here to walk beside you, so you never forget it." Thunder cracked like a drum across the heavens. But in the little room, Amara felt another stillness take hold, the stillness of a heart finding its anchor. Rain hammered the clinic roof in relentless sheets, drumming against the thin shingles as if to break them apart. The oil lamp flickered with each draft that slipped through the cracks, its wavering glow casting gold across their faces. Between the roar of the storm and the thundering of her heart, the world shrank to just the two of them. Luke stood before her, clothes soaked, hair plastered to his brow, yet his eyes burned like a private fire. He stepped closer, until breath mingled in the narrow space between them. His voice came rough, low, aching with truth. "I've never trusted anyone the way I trust you. To me, you're not a colored doctor, not a woman scorned by every glance. You're the one who's kept this heart alive." Amara trembled, not from cold, but from the force of his words, piercing the walls she had built over years of survival. In his eyes, she was no longer a fighter standing alone against the world. She was simply herself, seen and worthy. Luke's hand rose, coarse and warm, brushing her cheek where tears still clung. His touch was reverent, as if holding something too precious to break. He bent nearer, breath grazing her skin, his whisper slipping beneath the roar of rain. "I want to be the first man you kiss, and the last man you love." Amara closed her eyes. In that instant, the fortress in her chest crumbled. The jeers, the sneers, the cruel laughter of saloon men, all scattered, carried off like storm-born leaves. Only silence remained, deep and steady, as his lips found hers. The kiss was tender, unhurried. It claimed nothing, demanded nothing, only promised she belonged, at least in one heart. Her hands, unthinking, pressed against his chest, where his heart beat fierce beneath the wet cloth. The warmth there seeped into her, melting the frost of years spent in exile. When at last the kiss broke, breath ragged, they stayed close, forehead to forehead, air shared between them, unwilling to fracture the fragile stillness. "You're mad, Luke Carver," she whispered, her smile trembling through tears. "Do you know what they'll say?" Luke's laugh came rough, soft, his gaze steady in the lamplight. "Let them. They've spoken all their lives. But this, This I'll speak for myself, and I'll not regret it. Her throat ached with words she could not say. She only searched his eyes, finding there the certainty she had longed for, the strength she had thought she would never have. Thunder boomed outside, rolling like a war drum. Yet within the little room, there were only two figures, hands entwined. Amara leaned her head to his shoulder, allowing herself, for the first time, to rest against another. Her lashes lowered in the rare safety of his hold. The lamp swayed, casting its trembling light around them, bearing silent witness to the vow spoken amidst the storm. For the first time since she had come to Hollow Creek, Amara did not feel alone, and for the first time she believed. Perhaps her heart was worthy too, worthy of love, whole and lasting. The storm-born kiss needed no witness. Hollow Creek carried it on its own tongue. A white cowboy and a black doctor, the words spilled from a drunk's mouth in the saloon, slid into the ears of gossiping women at the market, and by dawn had become the story on every corner. Some scoffed, "Carver's lost his wits." Others muttered, "Let's see how long that clinic lasts now." And there were eyes that stayed silent. But silence bore as much weight as scorn. Amara heard it all. Passing through the market, she caught half-finished sentences that died the moment she drew near. On the main street, boys whistled mockingly as she walked. Her heart tightened, as it always had. But this time, something was different. When she lifted her head, she saw Luke Carver's figure. He never spoke much. He only stood by her door when the crowd gathered, his tall frame and storm-gray gaze enough to still the loudest tongue. He did not fight, did not shout. His presence alone was a wall no one dared breach. Patients still came, a wound needing stitches, a woman laboring through childbirth, a child with a broken arm from a fall. They arrived with doubt in their eyes, but left lighter, their faith quietly planted. Truth could not be denied. Her hands healed. One afternoon, Amara was binding an old man's leg when noise swelled outside. Maddox's voice carried above the crowd, venomous. "How long before she truly kills someone? This town is being made a fool." Amara's hand clenched on the bandage. Memory of the storm returned. Luke's hand against her cheek, his voice raw in the rain. "I want to be the first man you kiss, and the last man you love." Fear rose, but the door swung open. Luke stepped out, sleeves rolled, eyes blazing, his words cut clean. "If anyone doubts, step inside. Look into the eyes of those she's saved, and tell them you'd rather lose these hands." A hush fell. Then Helen, the mother whose fevered boy had nearly died, rose trembling but strong. "If not for Dr. Johnson, my son would be buried. Should I thank Maddox for that?" The crowd stirred. Maddox's face darkened. His cane struck the ground before he turned away, retreating under the weight of defeat. Amara watched, and for the first time in her life, the weight of solitude eased. Always she had borne mockery alone, but now someone stood beside her, unyielding. That night she wrote by lamplight, "Rumor can destroy, but one person's faith, just one, can hold you upright. Today I stood not because I was strong, but because someone stood with me." After that standoff, Hollow Creek split in two. One half clung to spite, muttering about color and gender, branding her bond with Luke unnatural. They spat at her doorstep, hissed at the market, jeered in the saloon. But the other half began to soften. A cattleman came, arm torn from rope, and let her stitch him without a word. Before leaving, he only nodded, his eyes different, no longer doubtful, but acknowledging. A young woman came heavy with child, asking her to examine, and Helen, steadfast, told anyone who would listen, "Without Dr. Johnson, I'd have no son." These voices, steady and true, became her shield against Maddox's venom. Luke came often still. Sometimes he only leaned against the post outside, arms crossed, gaze steady as stone, guarding without a word. Amara would finish a treatment, look up, and find him there, like a sentinel, as though no force in Hollow Creek could break through that door. One crowded Sunday, as townsfolk poured from the chapel, Maddox raised his voice sharp. "Carver, you disgrace your bloodline. Plenty of white women, and you tie yourself to a black doctor." The street hushed, all eyes fixed on Luke. He met Maddox's glare and answered calmly, "I bring no disgrace. I choose the one I trust. Shame belongs to the man who builds his life by trampling others." Maddox faltered. Some scoffed, but others nodded quietly. For the first time, Hollow Creek heard a reply not of threats or fists, but of unshakable calm. That night, after Luke rode her home from a berth far out on the range, the sky spilled over with stars. The red dust road lay silent, crickets singing, horses breathing steady. Amara sat behind him, her hands resting lightly at his waist. She realized then her anchor was no longer only the small clinic, but the man who stood, unwavering, against the whole town for her sake. Later she opened her worn journal, writing beneath the lamplight. "I once thought strength meant bearing everything alone, but tonight I know strength is also the courage to trust someone to stand beside you, to let them walk through the storm with you." The prairie wind keened outside, but within the small room, Amara's heart beat steady, stronger than it had ever been. A year later, spring returned to Hollow Creek. The prairie stretched wide in wildflower bloom. White butterflies flickered above the creek banks, and strange birds sang into the warming wind. From the small wooden chapel, bells rang long and clear, calling the town to witness a simple ceremony that carried more weight than splendor. Amara stood at the altar in a plain white dress stitched by Mrs. Holloway. No lace, no trailing veil, only clean fabric that framed her proud bearing and shining eyes. On the benches, some pressed their lips in disapproval, some sat in silence, yet others offered genuine nods and small, warm smiles. Enough for Amara to know the long road she had walked had not been in vain. Luke waited at the end of the aisle, tall, storm-gray eyes catching the first light of morning. When she stepped forward, hand held by the little sister of a boy she had once saved, the room hushed. Her steps on the wooden floor, mingled with the sound of wind slipping through the chapel cracks, became the quiet hymn to mark their fate. It was no Eastern wedding, no orchestra, no fine wine, only the voices of a few townswomen singing, and a clutch of prairie blooms in Amara's hands. Yet in the gaze they held, nothing else was needed. "Do you vow to take her hand, through storm and through calm?" the pastor asked, his voice trembling with feeling. Luke's eyes never left hers. "I do." "And you, Amara Johnson, do you vow to walk with him to the end, to trust this love as you trust your breath?" Her smile broke soft, tears brightening her gaze. "I do." The words "I now pronounce" filled the chapel. When their lips met, suspicion dissolved, whispers fell to silence. Even the hardest hearts could not deny what stood plain before them: love, undeniable and true. Outside, spring wind tangled her hair, red dust lifting like a carpet unrolled before their steps. Not every hand clapped, but a few nods, a few handshakes were enough. Old Mr. Peterson, whose arm she had once stitched, hobbled forward and clasped her hand. "You've shown us. It isn't skin or sex, but the heart and the hands that heal." Amara gripped Luke's hand tighter, peace pounding in her chest. She knew their journey wasn't over. There would still be whispers, still sharp glances, but she was no longer alone. Each step was now matched by another, and love itself was the loudest answer they could give. That year, Amara grew her clinic, teaching young women to bind wounds, to use herbs, sowing seeds of knowledge and freedom. Luke worked the ranch, his back soaked in sweat, yet each evening found him on her steps, sharing sunsets in silence. People still spoke, some in spite, others in admiration. But with time, the white cowboy and the black doctor ceased to be a jeer, becoming instead a testament that in a red-dust western town, love could shake even the strongest wall of prejudice. A year after their vows, Amara wrote in her old journal, words trembling yet proud, "My path is not only to heal sickness, it is to prove that a black woman has the right to love and be loved, wholly for life. That is the legacy I leave for those who come after." Luke, reading over her shoulder, only smiled and pressed a kiss to her brow. Outside, the prairie blazed with sunlight. Hooves drummed faint in the distance, a song carrying en son, the song of two souls who chose to stand together against the world. Perhaps with age we learn that true love is not measured by applause nor by acceptance. It asks only that two hearts clasp hands and keep walking, whatever storms may rise. Amara and Luke did not choose the easy road. They chose the real one. And in that choice they left behind a legacy, not merely of marriage but of proof that every soul is worthy of love and of trust. Dear friends, if this tale stirs memory of a brave choice in your own life, of a hand that once held yours through the storm, share it in the comments below. Each story is a flame, keeping the warmth alive for us all. And don't forget to like and subscribe, so we may meet again in more Wild West love stories, where even in the harshest country, love and faith still find their way home.